Hello, hello, Power Bankers. I'm your host, Jacqueline Swilly, and you're listening to Power Banking, the podcast for women leaders in male dominated industries. Hello, hello, Power Banking family. How are you doing today? Well, we have a guest today that is going to drop some gems and blow your socks off. So grab your notebooks. Don, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jacqueline. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So today's guest is Dawn Christian, as I mentioned in our intro, and she's all things phenomenal. She is an expert in diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and she's going to be sharing with us some of her leadership lessons that has helped her along the way, as well as her take on diversity and inclusion, which I absolutely love. So, Dawn, to get started, tell us a little bit more about you beyond your bio.
Yeah, of course. So I am beyond, the things that are in my bio. I am a mother. I am a wife. Motherhood is relatively new to me. My son is 2 years old. I hail from Southern California, South Pasadena to be specific. I'm diehard LA teams all the way, even if they're no longer LA teams. Um, but out here and I live in the DC metro area. But beyond that, what I found myself to be is just really committed to making real, authentic, and transparent, not to use the buzzwords, but true and authentic impacts as well as connections with the people that surround me. And I've found that as I've grown both personally and professionally, that has become my number one focus in my life, to be connected to those that are connected to bigger things than just themselves or a corporate title or a function, but to connectedness in the world.
That is so beautiful that the theme of being connected, and that's something I can definitely say is true to you, that those authentic connections. So I don't think it's a buzzword with you at all. I truly believe that through and through. So let's hop into the episode and tell us, what is your definition of leadership?
I love that question. I think I have a shared love, and I won't say hate, but I will say dismay in how trite the term leadership has become. And so for me, leadership is defined as, really kind of taking a sense of where you are, either literally or figuratively, and where others are around you, and figuring out, to go back to my earlier comment, how it is that you can connect to those around you to continue your own growth, but also how you can connect to those to help inspire their growth, learn from where it is that you've been. And I don't think that leadership lies in a title. I think leadership lies in the way that you move, and again, yes, in the way that you connect to people, organizations, and purposes as you move through your purpose in life.
That is so beautiful. And as we go through different stages of life, we are going to be connected to different people. And regardless of whether we have a title or not, there is an opportunity to lead. So, along those lines, when you think of your definition of leadership, who comes to mind when you associate them with leadership?
Yeah, you know what? I think through this, and I can think of so many of the names that we all, can spout out. Your Oprahs, your all of these people. But what I've learned in leadership is, and this is going to sound crazy to most people that will hear this, but the most authentic leader that I think I know at this point is my 2-year-old son Chase. And the reason why I say that is because his life is so new and he has so much to learn that everything he needs, everything that inspires him, makes him happy, makes him sad, what he gives you is nothing else that he can do but his authentic, real reaction, visceral, in time reaction. And I know that sounds crazy, but when I watch this young man and when I watch young people, and I say my son because he's the closest to me, but when I watch this young man and when I watch young people in particular, I find that those that have more to learn are leading in ways that we that are experienced and who've gone through things should be taking notes on. And what I mean by that is we should be learning more than we're trying to tell. If
Yes.
for every one of these conversations that I'm having with you or with anyone else and other podcasts and talks that I've given, I try to amp that up, you know, 3 to 5 times over and read something else and learn something else from the conversation itself, not from what I said and how I can craft my story, but from what someone else said and how that can influence what's needed and what may move me to talk about the subjects of diversity and inclusion and equity in a way that is making sense and is not cookie cutter.
That is so real. And I don't think you're crazy at all because I have said, as an auntie of many, many kids, that they are excellent leaders and they're also my negotiation favorite students. I learn from them because you're right. They have a hunger to learn and they're not offended when they have to learn something new. It's so exciting for them. So, thank you for bringing that up. Along those lines, let's go a little bit deeper on there. How does your son impact the way you approach diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, great question. So I am African American, and my son is African American by both parents, so fully African American. And I make that point because I, as a black woman, I grew up with, you know, four black brothers and three sisters, and things were different from us from the start. I grew up in Thousand Oaks in South Pasadena, California, and for those of you that know those areas, well, we were the black folks, right, most of the time. And I
Uh-huh.
and I bring that up because the way that I need to look at this young man at 2 and have a consciousness about what's going on in the world that may impact him, even though he's not moving by himself at this point. But what kind of words do I want him to hear? Watching the news today, I grew up having to watch the news from the time I can remember for at least 60 minutes every evening. Reading the paper, I was required to read the paper and kind of, you know, give a dissertation and such about what was current and going on in the world. And I have to say that I would be nervous to make my son do that today because of the narrative that is out there about who and what he is, what he represents, and what he needs to be. So I counter that with the experiences of the other narrative, the true narrative of what people, not just people who look like him, but people, and yes, specifically people who look like him and reflect his culture and what he is, what they are doing that the news, that the media, that the narrative may not offer. And so I think when I look at how I want him to be formed, I try to balance all of those things that he's trying to learn and trying to see and encourage him in the midst of a lot of uncertainty. And what I want him to be comfortable with is that it will be uncertain. But, son, what you are in control of is how you will deal with, process, and maneuver through those uncertain times and represent who you are, not by someone else's terms, but by your own, and how you will be cognizant of your contextualization, your narrative, the words you choose to use, and the exposures that you intend to have, and how will that continue to form how you influence the world that you will reach, and the fact that leadership is not an option for you from the day you'll start school and even before that until the day that you decide to have a career and will be leading others in a formal capacity. So I hope that answered your question, but I think what it
Yes.
makes me do is check for the environment, check for the culture, and not take an assumption that because he's two it doesn't matter, because it matters.
It totally does. You have this thing that you've given in some of your talks, and I've heard you reference it in a previous podcast. I belong here. Can you tell us more about
Mhm.
that?
Thank you so much for that opportunity. Yes, I belong here is my social consciousness brand, but it is authentically what I've thought throughout my life as I was educated at UC Berkeley and at Cornell. And again, those are predominantly white institutions where the numbers when I enrolled at Berkeley, the day I enrolled, I think we were African American representation was somewhere between the 14% or higher mark. The day I graduated, it was 0.02%.
Wow.
And when I was at Cornell, I was one of six students in my class of African American heritage. And on my first day, I was told that I was admitted to the class because they needed someone to fill the spot. And I will also say that my first day of school, period, in kindergarten at 6 years old, um, a little girl turned around and looked at me during story time and called me an N word, and I didn't even know what the N word was.
Wow.
And I came home and I said that to my father, and he said, "Who said that to you? Where did you get that from?" And I said, "The girl in my class." And I that was my education on racism at 6 years old in kindergarten. And so throughout my life, and even in my profession now, and what I do outside of the diversity work that I've worked on, I'm often the only one, whether that's the only female, whether that's the only African American, whether that's uh, you know, the only young person of a certain age. I'm often that only one. And I've had to claim for myself that I belong here, and not only that I belong here, but I belong here just as I am. And
Yes.
what I need to, and really what it is it's a statement, it's a movement, it is a social consciousness that's saying, I'm not ascribing to your imposter syndrome. And I'm not going to sit here and think for one moment that of all the people that they could have admitted to a top MBA program that they just happened to pick me, really? Or
Right.
because they needed some brown skin, or that because at a 30,000 person school, that the only way that I could be there is because, I either ran well or, played some type of sport, which I am a student athlete also, but that wasn't how I was there for academic purposes. So I'm not at all demeaning student athletes, but the assumptions that folks make about our abilities should not become our adopted and adapted identities to make them more comfortable. I'd rather make them be comfortable with being uncomfortable with the fact that we show up, and we show up in many forms, and that includes qualified. So it is an inspiration, but it is also a claim, and it is my hope that through I have an apparel line, and through my speaking and through the connections that I make, that I'm empowering people to claim their space physically, mentally, and also professionally, about where you are in life, and the fact that right where you are, as you are, is right where you belong if that's what you're choosing to do with your precious time here on this earth.
Yes. So you've alluded to some of the things that you've done in your life. You're a student athlete, you've attended some prestigious universities. I know personally that you were involved in diversity and inclusion work early in your career before those
Hmm.
terms were even popular. So tell us more about your leadership story.
Yeah, so I think, and again, some great questions. I think for me, and to give some context, my parents are from the segregated South. I'm the youngest of six children, seven technically, children of a blended family. So there's some time between the first child born and myself. And I have parents of a certain era that, regardless of where I grew up and where I lived, there was a certain thing about coming up at a time where you had to have your own. right? We had to be our own lawyers and doctors and accountants because there was no other resource for us. And
Right.
how that inspired my parents to teach us that means there's no limits because I've seen it done. I don't really care what's going on in the world. You can do this because we've done it and I know we're capable of it. And so I think when I look at my leadership story, it's inspired by a woman who was a freedom rider, went to Fisk, sat at lunch counters in Nashville, Tennessee, and had cigarette burns on her neck. As she sat there trying to fight for the right for me to walk into any place and get served. That woman was my mother. Um, it's served by a man who, was flying fighter jets. In the 60s for the Air Force who saw that the Confederate flag was prominently on U.S. Air Force uniforms, and he created his own patch with a black fist raised over the Confederate flag, and that became part of the black uniforms of the few that were flying. That man was my father. So I think for my leadership story, when it comes to where I stand, I see myself having privilege in a world that when we talk about diversity and inclusion and what privilege is, sometimes because of the lexicon, we're thinking privilege means only one group has privilege and only one type of representation has the ability to spin that privilege. And my privilege is being aware that there are marginalizations, there are limits, but my privilege is being part of a family that inspired me how to network through those things. I've been able to have mentors formally and informally, and people that probably didn't even know they were mentors to me that I've modeled myself after. And yes, to your point, I've been committed to diversity and inclusion before there was certification or a study to be had, for 20 some odd years of my corporate experience, where I've always been part of the conversation about representation and about belonging and about culture. And then I actively was a part of the committees, whether solicited or not, to show up and help to influence the change. I work in biotech pharma. This is not an area, as a lot of STEM careers are not, where there's not a lot of representation. And so I think part of my accountability is being that one in the room. If I disappear, then who's representing? And who can see themselves in me and perhaps inspire them to apply to a company, them to take a major, them to make a decision to attend a school because they saw no reflections of themselves. And while I don't think these things should always be taken on the chin and that you always need to be the sacrificial lamb, that is not at all what I'm saying, or the token, what I do think is that if you're going to show up and if this is something that is important to you, if you want somebody to feel a sense of belonging and a sense of culture that is different, more inspired, or just like the one you have, if you're fortunate to have that, then there's something about us showing up and staying committed to having the conversations, taking an active role to be a mentor or a sponsor, hiring people who are qualified and who can change the narrative of what it means to show up for a job or a function. And so I hope that that answers you and inspires someone else to think about what it means um, to be who you are when you show up, but also to inspire and take some accountability in informing how it is that people are attracted to or see themselves or see reflections of all the greatness that all of us, no matter what your color, your gender, or anything else is, um, getting things done. And creating that access and that I think that access and that equity comes out of people being truly vested, and the people that should be the most vested should be the people that reflect in some way those marginalized groups.
Thank you so much for going deep on that. There's so many notes that I've just taken listening to you speak, and I really appreciate your transparency and sharing the legacy of leadership that has been passed down from your family. What tools do you think have been helpful in your leadership journey and more specifically in your corporate career?
Yeah, I think, and see, this is going to be tough for some folks. And again, I'm speaking from a lens of the only person I've been allowed to be throughout my life, which is, female, African American, of a certain age. I'm 41 years old. I say that without any shame. I'm an older, mother than some. So all of these things that weigh into your corporate career, I think, um, I have been able to not in the sense of being, in the places that I've been, where I grew up, where I went to school, where I've worked, I've held those who don't look at like me, if they say they're inspired to support change or a culture, and even if they don't, if I see a sense of interest in me particularly or others, I hold myself accountable to ask questions, but also to create advocates and to create allies out of conversations and storytelling, to include the non marginalized in these conversations and in these initiatives because they need to be a part of it. This can't be something that we do in a silo and expect for them to understand. Um, Now, again, I'm not asking you all to be, the 1-800, I know all the answers to whatever that marginalized group is. That's not what I'm saying. But I
Right.
am saying, but I am saying that if you're posed a question, find ways to respectfully and not always educate, but be available for the conversation and the storytelling that is necessary to help people connect with the differences, the diversity, and the marginalization that exists, so that they can understand it. Because I would beg to to question if you live your life in a privileged state of being a white male in a leadership role for most of your life, how, if you don't have access to these other experiences, could you be expected to relate? And that doesn't mean that they have no accountability to find out. But I think, in short, what I'm saying is be willing to tell your story. Storytelling creates connectivity, creates a conversation, and you don't have to say it all at one time. You can do this over time. But I say encourage advocacy and allyship through having conversations with people who look like and people who don't look like you, and be willing to have the difficult conversations that push your ideas and their frame of mind and your frame of mind, so that you also have the working knowledge to understand what challenges really exist in the organizations or the world or the functions that you're working in, so you can be more tactical and more strategic about addressing them. It's information, it's your best data point conversations to me.
Yes, yes, and yes. I love that part. I need to go back and take more notes on that because you were talking fast and I was like, oh, yeah, all of this is so good. So, Don, what book are you reading right now?
I am reading, loving, and living Minda Hart's The Memo. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so many times. I think I might be her official first groupie. I'm not really sure. But I so appreciate just the rawness of, it's like she's living in my head, and I it's just, it gives voice so much to um a well written, authentic, real, but well cited. And I, coming from schools of heavy theory and data and science in my background, I like the fact that it's there, but she puts it to you in a conversational way that I think it's a safe book for women of color to not only read, but to also be able to give to that same ally advocate that I ideally thinking about as you ask and have those conversations. What you can't say, I think she's saying very well.
I agree 100%. Minda's done a phenomenal job with this book and raising the level of consciousness. And to your point, the way that she says things you might not be able to say directly, but you can pass along the book, and that person, that advocate, that ally will be able to get the point exactly. So, for those of you who haven't, make sure you pick up The Memo by Minda Hart because it is a required read for anyone in the workplace and especially for women of color. So, what advice would you give a leader, Don, who's currently navigating change at work?
Yes. So I will not give you the line that the only constant in the world is change. I think we all know that, right? I think
Right.
the advice that I will give is breathe through the change. Have the conversations so you can understand the contextualization and the narrative around that change to assess for yourself, do you belong in this space? And if you do, then what, if anything, do you need to speak up on, adapt to, and I don't mean assimilate to, I mean adapt to, and what do you need to maybe advocate for yourself? And then also be okay if the change is not okay for you. And then take some control about having the conversations that you need to have with yourself and with your support system, your advocates, your sponsors, your mentors about whether or not and at what rate do you need to be active about navigating through that change. And again, one thing that hasn't come up directly, but I will speak to it because it's a part of the conversation that I'm trying to build enough courage to say in my own remarks, is that in a lot of ways, when we deal with change, we neglect the mental health piece of it all, of how much chaos it can cause for ourselves, for our families, and for the people who care about us. So I say if you need to have the support, whether it's counseling, whether it's, you know, you you settle on things better when you listen to some music, or when you take a dance class, or when you journal, or if you are able to write a gratitude journal to yourself day to day just to inspire you through that change. I say make sure that you do enough self care and have enough of a support system around you before the change, to be able to have someone to go to and confide in and support you through whatever the effect of that change is.
That is spot on. Ladies, please take that to heart because it's so important that you do the work for yourself and take care of yourself. Don, you are so amazing. As I said earlier in the podcast, y'all, great episode. I knew it was going to be phenomenal. Don, tell the power banking community how they can connect to you and also where can they learn more about I Belong Here.
Yes, absolutely. So I live probably a little too much on LinkedIn, so you can find me, Dawn Christian. In quotes, it'll say Randall, which is my maiden name, so that will be the right one. So you can find me on LinkedIn, but you can also, and please do connect, but you can also find I Belong Here and reach me directly at belongbydawnchristian.com. And that's where I'll be taking inquiries about either speaking engagements or I Belong Here, the brand. But LinkedIn or Belong by Dawn Christian .com is the other way to reach me. So I hope to connect with you all. And thanks again for this wonderful, wonderful opportunity.
Well, thank you for taking time to join me. This was great. And until next time, Power Banking family, continue to emulate excellence and eliminate excuses. Gotta give a special thank you to our episode sponsor, Anchor.fm. Listen, if you're thinking about starting a podcast, Anchor is the way to do it. This is why. One, it's free to get started. They have tools that allow for you to record from your phone or your computer, and they handle the distribution on all of the places where you find podcasts. So if you want to start a podcast, this is the one-stop shop to get it all done. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. If you have a suggestion for a guest for an upcoming episode of PowerBanking, we are now accepting requests for 2020. So let us know what women who are working in traditionally male-dominated industries inspire you, because we want to talk to them on the PowerBanking Podcast. Just send an email to info@zerogap.co. And there's no M on that, info@zerogap.co, with the subject line podcast guest. We'll talk to you soon. Hello, my Power Banking family. I am so excited for today's episode. I had a very engaging conversation with the diversity and inclusion, and I put emphasis on inclusion expert, Dawn Christian, who is based out of Washington, D.C. She is the founder of the I Belong Here inclusion movement. Her conversation was so captivating. She was so raw and honest, talking about her motherhood journey, as well as sharing with us some of her background from her youth with her parents and the professions that they held in her early years. Grab a notebook. This is another expansion episode where you're going to learn so much. But for those of you who have a passion for inclusion and diversity in the workplace, you definitely want to take note to some of the philosophies that she shares in this episode.